Hello, I'm Joan Nobling. I live at Benton on the 6th floor, and today I'm going to be reading a chapter from a book called The Dutch House, a novel by Ann Patchett. And I'd like to read you the information on the front cover here, the fly cover. Do you think it's possible to ever see the past as it actually was? I asked my sister. We were sitting in her car, parked in front of the Dutch house, in the broad daylight of early summer. At the end of the Second World War, Cyril Conroy combines luck and a single canny investment to build an immense real estate empire, propelling his family from poverty to enormous wealth. His first order of business is to buy the Dutch house, a lavish estate in the suburbs of Philadelphia. Meant as a surprise for his wife, the house sets in motion the undoing of everyone he loves. The story is told by Cyril's son Danny as he and his older sister, the brilliantly acerbic and self-assured Maeve, are exiled by their stepmother from the house where they grew up. These siblings are thrown back into the poverty their parents had escaped from, and find that all they have to count on is each other. It is this unshakable bond that both saves lives and thwarts their futures. Set over the course of 5 decades, the house is a dark fairy tale about two smart people who overcome their past. By every outward sign of success, Danny and Maeve are only truly comfortable when they are together. Throughout their lives, they return to the warm narrative of what lost with humor and age. When at last they're forced to confront people who have left them behind, the relationship between an adult brother and his ever-protective sister is finally tested. The Dutch is the story of a paradise lost, a tour de force that digs deeply into questions of innocence, love, forgiveness, how we want to see ourselves and who we really are. This fills the sense you may read it to discover what happens. Danny and Maeve will stay with you for a very long time. And now, begin to read Chapter 1, Part 1. The first time our father brought Andrea to the Dutch house, Sandy, our housekeeper, came to my sister's room and told us to come downstairs. Your father is a friend who wants you to meet, he said. Is it a work friend? Maeve asked. She was older and so had a more complex understanding of friendship. Sandy considered the question. I'd say not. Where's your brother? Window seat, he said. Sandy had to pull the draperies back to find me. Why do you have to close the drapes? I was reading. Privacy, I thought, though at 8 I had no notion of privacy. I liked the word, and I liked the boxed-in feel the draperies gave when they were closed. As for the visitor, it was a mystery. Our father didn't have friends, at least not the kind who came to the house late on a Saturday afternoon. I left my secret spot and went to the top of the stairs to lie down on the rug that covered the landing. I knew from experience I could see into the drawing room by looking between the newel post and first banister if I was on the floor. There was our father in front of the fireplace with a woman, and from what I could tell, we were studying the portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Van Hobeek. I got up back to my sister's room and make my report. It's a woman, I said to Maeve. Sandy would have known that already. Sandy asked me if I'd brushed my teeth, by which he meant had I brushed them that morning. No one brushed their teeth at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Sandy had to do everything herself because Jocelyn had Saturdays off. Sandy would have laid the fire and answered the door and offered drinks, and on top of all that was now responsible for my teeth. Sandy was off on Mondays. Sandy and Jocelyn were both off on Sundays because my father didn't think people should be made to work on Sundays. I did, I said, because I probably had. Well, do it again, she said, and brush your hair. The last part she meant for my sister, whose hair was long and black and as thick as 10 horsetails tied together. No amount of brushing ever made it look brushed. Once we were deemed presentable, Maeve and I went downstairs and stood beneath the wide archway of the foyer, watching our father and Andrea watch the Van Hobeeks. They didn't notice us, or they didn't acknowledge us, hard to say, and so we waited. Maeve and I knew how to be quiet in the house, a habit born of trying not to irritate our father, though it irritated him more when he felt we were sneaking up on him. He was wearing his blue suit. He never wore a suit on Saturdays. For the first time, I could see that his hair was starting to gray at the back. Standing next to Andrea, he looked even taller than he was. It must be a comfort having them with you, Andrea said to him, not of his children, but of his paintings. Mr. and Mrs. Van Hobeek, who had no first names that I'd ever heard, were old in their portraits, but not entirely ancient. They both dressed in black and stood with an erect formality that spoke of another time. Even in their separate frames, they were so together, so married, I always thought it must have been one large painting that someone cut in half. Andrea's head tilted back to study those 4 cunning eyes that appeared to follow a boy with disapproval, no matter which of the sofas he chose to sit on. Maeve, silent, stuck her finger in between my ribs to make me yelp, but I held on to myself. We had not yet been introduced to Andrea, who from the back looked small and neat in her belted dress, a dark hat no bigger than a saucer, pinned over a twist of pale hair. Having been schooled by nuns, I knew better than to embarrass a guest by laughing. Andrea would have had no way of knowing that the people in the paintings had come with the house, that everything in the house had come with the house. The drawing room Van Hobeeks were the showstoppers, life-sized documentation of people worn by time, their stern and unlovely faces rendered with Dutch exactitude and a distinctly Dutch understanding of light. But there were dozens of other lesser portraits on every floor. Their children in the hallways, their ancestors in the bedrooms, the unnamed people they'd admired scattered throughout. There was also one portrait of Eve when she was 10, and while it wasn't nearly as big as the paintings of the Van Hobeeks, it was every bit as good. My father had brought in a famous artist from Chicago on the train. As the story goes, he was supposed to paint our mother, but our mother, who hadn't been told that the painter was coming to stay in our house for 2 weeks, refused to sit, and so he painted Maeve instead. When the portrait was finished and framed, my father hung it in the drawing room, right across from the Van Hobeeks. Maeve liked to say that was where she learned to stare people down. "Danny," my father said when finally he turned, looking like he expected us to be exactly where we were, "come say hello to Mrs. Smith." I will always believe that Andrea's face fell for an instant when she looked at Maeve and me. Even if my father hadn't mentioned his children, she would have known he had them. Everyone in Elkins Park knew what went on in the Dutch house. Maybe she thought we would stay upstairs. She'd come to see the house, after all, not the children. Or maybe the look on Andrea's face was just for Maeve, who at 15 and in her tennis shoes was already a head taller than Andrea in her heels. Maeve had been inclined to slouch when it first became apparent she was going to be taller than all the other girls in her class and most of the boys, and our father was relentless in his correction of her posture. Head up, shoulders back, might as well have been her name. For years he thumped her between the shoulder blades with the flat of his palm whenever he passed her in a room, the unintended consequence of which was that Maeve now stood like a soldier in the Queen's court, or like the Queen herself. Even I could see how she might have been intimidating. Her height, the shining black wall of hair, the way she would lower her eyes to look at a person rather than bend her neck. But at 8, I was still comfortably smaller than the woman our father would later marry. I held out my hand to shake her little hand and said my name. Then Maeve did the same. Though our story will always be remembered that Maeve and Andrea were at odds right from the start, that wasn't true. Maeve was perfectly fair and polite when they met, and she remained fair and polite until doing so was no longer possible. "How do you do?" Maeve said, and Andrea replied that she was very well. Andrea was well. Of course she was. It had been Andrea's goal for years to get inside the house, to loop her arm through our father's arm when going up the wide stone steps and across the red tiled terrace. She was the first woman our father had brought home since our mother left, though Maeve told me that he had had something going with our nanny for a while, an Irish girl named Fiona. "You think he was sleeping with Fluffy?" I asked her. Fluffy was what we called Fiona when we were children, partly because I had a hard time with the name Fiona, and partly because of the soft waves of red hair that fell down her back in a transfixing cloud. The news of this affair came to me, as most information did, many years after the fact, in a car parked outside the Dutch house with my sister. "Either that or she cleaned his room in the middle of the night," Maeve said. My father, in flagrant delicto? I shook my head. I can't picture it. "You shouldn't try to picture it." "God, Danny, that's disgusting. Anyway, you were practically a baby during the Fluffy administration. I'm surprised you'd even remember her." But Fluffy had hit me with a wooden spoon when I was 4 years old. I still have a small scar in the shape of a golf club beside my left eye. The mark of Fluffy, Maeve called it. Fluffy claimed she'd been cooking a pot of applesauce when I startled her by grabbing her skirt. She said she was trying to get me away from the stove and had certainly never meant to hit me, though I'd think it would be hard to accidentally hit a child in the face with a spoon. The story was only interesting insofar as it was my first distinct memory of another person or the Dutch house or my own life. I didn't have a single memory of our mother, but I remembered Fluffy's spoon cracking into the side of my head. I remembered Maeve, who had been down the, who had been down the hall when I screamed, flying into the kitchen the way the deer would fly across the hedgerow at the back of the property. She threw herself into Fluffy, knocking her off the stove, the blue flames leaping as the boiling pot of applesauce crashed to the floor, so that we were all burned in pinpoint splatters. I was sent to the doctor's office for 6 stitches, and Maeve's hand was wrapped, and Fluffy was dismissed, even though I could remember her crying and saying how sorry she was, how it was only an accident. She didn't want to go. That was our father's other relationship, according to my sister, and she should know. If I was 4 when I got that scar, then she was already 11. As it happened, Fluffy's parents had worked for the Van Hobeeks as their driver and cook. Fluffy had spent her childhood in the Dutch house, or in the small apartment over the garage. So I had to wonder, when her name came up again after so many years, where she would have gone when she was told to leave. Fluffy was the only person in the house who had known the Van Hobeeks. Not even our father had met them, though we sat on their chairs and slept in their beds and ate our meals off their Delftware. The Van Hobeeks weren't the story, but in a sense, the house was the story, and it was their house. They had made their fortune in the wholesale distribution of cigarettes, a lucky business Mr. Van Hobeek had entered into just before the start of the First World War. Cigarettes were given to soldiers in the field for purposes of morale, and the habit followed them home to celebrate a decade of prosperity. The Van Hobeeks, richer by the hour, commissioned a house to be built on what was then farmland outside of Philadelphia. The stunning success of the house could be attributed to the architect, though by the time I thought to go looking, I could find no other extant examples of his work. It could be that one or both of those Van Hobeeks had been some sort of aesthetic visionary, or that the property inspired a marvel beyond what any of them had imagined, or that America, after the First World War, was teeming with craftsmen who worked to standards long since abandoned. Whatever the explanation, the house they wound up with, the house we later wound up with, was a singular confluence of talent and luck. I can't explain how a house that was 3 stories high could seem like just the right amount of space, but it did. Or maybe it would be better to say that it was too much of a house for anyone, an immense and ridiculous waste, but that we never wanted it to be different. The Dutch house, as it came to be known in Elkins Park and Jenkintown and Glenside and all the way to Philadelphia, referred not to the house's architecture, but to its inhabitants. The Dutch house was the place where those Dutch people with the unpronounceable name lived. Seen from certain vantage points of distance, it appeared to float several inches above the hill it sat on. The panes of glass that surrounded the glass front doors were as big as storefront windows and held in place by wrought iron vines. The windows both took in the sun and reflected it back across the wide lawn. Maybe it was neoclassical, though with a simplicity in the lines that came closer to Mediterranean or French. And while it was not Dutch, the blue Delft mantels in the drawing room, library, and master bedroom were said to have been pried out of a castle in Utrecht and sold to the Van Hobeeks to pay a prince's gambling debts. The house, complete with mantels, had been finished in 1922. They had 7 good years before the bankers started jumping out of windows, Maeve said, giving our predecessors their place in history. The first I ever heard of the property that had been sold off was that first day Andrea came to the house. She followed our father to the foyer and was looking out at the front lawn. "It's so much glass," Andrea said, as if making a calculation to see if the glass could be changed, swapped out for an actual wall. "Don't you worry about people looking in?" Not only could you see into the Dutch house, you could see straight through it. The house was shortened in the middle, and the deep foyer led directly into what we called the observatory, which had a wall of windows facing the backyard. And with the driveway, you could let your eye go up the front steps, across the terrace, through the front doors, across the long marble floor of the foyer, through the observatory, and catch sight of the lilacs waving obliviously in the garden behind the house. Our father glanced toward the ceiling and then to either side of the door, as he were just now considering this. "We're far enough from the street," he said. On this May afternoon, the wall of linden trees that ran along the property line was thick with leaves, and the slant of green lawn, where I rolled like a dog in the summers, was both deep and wide. "But at night," Andrea said, her voice concerned, "I wonder if there wouldn't be some way to hang drapes." Drapes that blocked the view struck me not only as impossible, the singlest, stupidest idea I'd ever heard. "You've seen us at night?" Maeve asked. "Well, you have to remember the land that was here when they built the place," our father said, speaking over Maeve. "There were more than 200 acres. The property went all the way to Melrose Park." "But why would they have sold it?" Suddenly Andrea could see how much more sense the house would have made had there been no other houses. The sight line should have gone far past the slope of the lawn, past the peony bed and the roses. The eye was meant to travel down a wide valley and bank into a forest, so that even if the Van Hobeeks or one of their guests were to look out a window from the ballroom at night, the only light they'd see would be starlight. There wasn't a street back then. There wasn't a neighborhood, though now both the street and the Bushbaum's house across the street were perfectly visible in the winter when the leaves came off the trees. "Money," Maeve said. "Money," father said, nodding. "It wasn't a complicated idea. Even at 8, I was able to figure it out." "But they were wrong," Andrea said. There was a tightness around her mouth. "Think about how beautiful this place must have been. They should have had more respect, if you ask me. The house is a piece of art." And then I did laugh, because what I understood Andrea to say was that the Van Hobeeks should have asked her before they sold the land. My father, irritated, told Maeve to take me upstairs, as if I might have forgotten the way. Ready-made cigarettes lined up in their cartons were a luxury for the rich, as were acres never walked on by the people who owned them. Bit by bit, the land was shaved away from the house. The demise of the estate was a matter of public record, history recorded in property deeds. Parcels were sold to pay debts, 10 acres, then 50, then 28. Elkins Park came closer and closer to the door. In this way, the Van Hobeek family made it through the Depression, only to have Mr. Van Hobeek die of pneumonia in 1940. One Van Hobeek boy died in childhood, and the 2 older sons died in the war. Mrs. Van Hobeek died in 1945, when there was nothing left to sell but the side yard. The house and all it contained went back to the bank, dust to dust. Fluffy stayed behind, courtesy of the Pennsylvania Savings and Loan, and was paid a small stipend to manage the property. Fluffy's parents were dead, or maybe they'd found other jobs. At any rate, she lived alone above the garage, checking the house every day to make sure the roof wasn't leaking and the pipe burst. She straight path from the garage, the front doors, and left the rest of the lawn grow wild. She picked the fruit from the trees that were left near the back of the house and made apple butter and canned the peaches for winter. And by the time our father bought the place in 1946, raccoons had taken over the ballroom and chewed into the wiring. Fluffy went into the house only when the sun was straight overhead, the very hour when all nocturnal animals were piled up together and fast asleep. The miracle was they didn't burn the place down. The raccoons were eventually captured and disposed of, but they left behind their fleas, and the fleas sifted into everything. Maeve said her earliest memories of life in the house were of scratching, and of how Fluffy dotted each welt with a Q-tip dipped in calamine lotion. My parents had hired Fluffy to be my sister's nanny. First time Maeve and I ever parked on Van Hobeek Street, Van Hobeek, mispronounced as Van Hobeek by everyone in Elkins Park, was the first time I'd come home from Cote for spring break. Spring was something of a misnomer that year, since there was a foot of snow on the ground, an April Fool's Day joke to keep a bitter winter. True spring, I knew from my first half semester at boarding school, was for the boys whose parents took them sailing in Bermuda. "What are you doing?" I asked her when she stopped in front of the Bushbaum's house across the street from the Dutch house. "I want to see something." Maeve lit and pushed in the cigarette lighter. "Nothing to see here," I said to her. "Move along." I was in a crappy mood because of the weather and what I saw as the inequity between what I had and what I deserved. But still, I was glad to be back in Elkins Park, glad to be in my sister's car, the old blue Oldsmobile wagon of our childhood that my father let her have when she got her own apartment. Because I was 15 and generally an idiot, I thought that the feeling of home I was experiencing had to do with the car and where it was parked, instead of attributing it wholly and gratefully to my sister. "Are you in a rush to get someplace?" She shook a cigarette out of the pack, then put her hand over the lighter. "If you weren't right there to catch the lighter, it would eject too forcibly and burn a hole in the seat of the floor mat or your leg, depending on where it landed. Do you drive over here when you're at school?" "Pop," she caught it and lit her cigarette. "I do not." "But here we are," I said. The snow came steady and soft as the light of day, last light of day, was folded in clouds. Maeve was an Icelandic truck driver at heart. No weather stopped her. But I had recently gotten off the train and I was old. I thought it would be nice to make grilled cheese sandwiches. As was the sight of endless ridicule, I never knew why. Only hours were thought to be manly. Maeve filled her lungs with smoke, exhaled, then turned off the car. "I thought about coming over here a couple of times, but I decided to wait for you." She smiled at me then, cranking the window down just far enough to let in a shelf of Arctic air. I had nagged her to give the cigarettes up before I left her school, and then neglected to tell her that I started. Smoking was what we did at Cote in lieu of taking baths. I craned my head to look up the drive. "Do you see them?" Maeve looked out the driver's side window. "I don't know why, but I just keep thinking about that first time she came to the house a million years ago. Do you even remember?" Of course I remembered. Who could forget Andrea showing up? "And she said it isn't about waiting that people were looking in our windows at night." No sooner was the wind out of the mouth than the foyer was flooded in the warm gold light of the chandelier. Then after a pause and the lights above the staircase went on, and a few moments after that, the light in the master bedroom on the second floor. The illumination of the Dutch house was timed so exactly to her words, it nearly stopped my heart. Of course Maeve had been coming to the house without me. She knew that Andrea turned on the lights the minute the sun went down. Denying it was just a bit of theatrics on my sister's part, and I appreciated her efforts once I realized them later. It made for one hell of a show. "Hey, look at that," I whispered. There were no leaves on the linden trees, and the snow was falling, but not too heavily. Sure enough, you could see right into the house, through the house, Not with any detail, of course, but memory filled in the picture. There was the round table beneath the chandelier, where Sandy had left our father's mail in the evening, and behind it, the grandfather clock that had been my job to wind every Sunday after Mass, so that the ship between the six would continue to gently rock between two blue rows of painted waves. I couldn't see the ship or the waves, but I knew. There was the half-moon console table against the wall, the cobalt vase with the painting of the girl and the dog, the two French chairs no one ever sat in, the giant mirror whose frame always made me think of the twisted arms of a golden octopus. Andrea crossed through the foyer as if on cue. We were too far away to see her face, but I knew her from the way she walked. Norma came down the stairs at full speed and then stopped abruptly because her mother would have told her not to run. Norma was taller now, although I guess it could have been right. She must have watched us, said, because before she ever came in that first time. Or maybe everybody watched us, everyone who ever drove down the street in winter. I reached into her purse and took out the cigarettes. That seems a little self-aggrandizing, Maeve said. Everyone? They teach us that at Coat. She laughed. I could tell she hadn't been expecting to laugh, and it pleased me to no end. 5 whole days with you at home, she said, blowing smoke out the open window. The best 5 days of the year. Trouble here. Chapter 2, I believe somebody else reads.
Chapter 2 of the Dutch House. After her first appearance at the Dutch House, Andrea lingered like a virus. As soon as we were sure we'd seen the last of her, and months would go by without a mention of her name, there she'd be at the dining room table again, chastened by her absence at first, and then slowly warming over time. Andrea, fully warmed, talked about nothing but the house. She was forever going on about some detail of the crown molding or speculating as to the exact height of the ceiling, as if the ceiling were entirely new to us. "In Dart," she'd say, pointing up. Just when she'd reached the point of being truly intolerable, she'd disappear again, and the relief would wash over Maeve and me, and we assumed our father, with its glorious silence. There was the Sunday when we came from Mass and found her sitting in one of the white iron chairs by the pool, or Maeve found her. Maeve had been walking through the library and had seen her through the window just by chance. She didn't call for our father the way I would have. She just walked around to the back door of the kitchen and went outside. "Mrs. Smith?" Maeve called, shading her eyes with her hand. We called her Mrs. Smith until they were married, having never been invited to do otherwise. But after they were married, I'm sure she would have preferred us to call her Mrs. Conroy. But that would have only intensified the awkwardness, seeing as how Maeve and I were Conroys as well. Maeve told me Andrea was startled, and who knows, maybe she'd been sleeping. "Where's your father?" "In the house." Maeve looked over her shoulder. "Was he expecting you?" "I was expecting him an hour ago," Andrea corrected. Since it was Sunday, Sandy and Jocelyn were both off. I don't think they would have been in if we weren't home, but I don't know that for sure. Sandy was the warmer of the two, Jocelyn more suspicious. They didn't like Andrea, and they probably would have made her wait outside until we got home. It was only a little cold and nice enough to sit by the pool. The sunlight was glittering across the blue water, the tender lines of moss growing up between the flagstones. Maeve told her we'd been to church, and then they just stared at each other, neither of them looking away. "I'm half Dutch, you know," Andrea finally said. "I beg your pardon?" "On my mother's side, she was full-blood Dutch." "We're Irish," Maeve said. Andrea nodded, as if there had been some disagreement that now was settled in her favor. When it became clear there would be no more further conversation, Maeve went inside to tell our father Mrs. Smith was waiting by the pool. I'm having trouble with this. "Where in the hell park?" Maeve said to me after our father had gone outside. She almost knew those days, especially not right after Mass. She always parks in front of the house. And so we went to find the car, looking first on the far side of the house, then back behind the garage. When none of the obvious spots panned out, we walked down the driveway. Stop a minute. I'm having trouble with this.
Yeah, there's no stopping. I'll just watch you.
Driveway, the pea gravel crunching beneath Sunday shoes, and onto the street. We had no idea where Andrea lived, but we knew she was not our neighbor, She hadn't just walked over. We finally found her colored Impala parked a block away. The front left corner crumpled in on itself. Maeve crouched down to inspect the damage, and I went so far as to touch the hanging fender, marveling at the headlight which had been spared. Clearly Andrea had banged into something, and she didn't want us to know. We didn't tell our father about the car. After all, he didn't tell us anything. He never talked about Andrea, not when she was gone, when she was back. He didn't tell us if he had her in mind for some role in the future. When she was there, he acted like she'd always been there. And when she was gone, we never wanted to remind him for fear he'd ask her back. In truth, I don't think he was particularly interested in Andrea. I just don't think he had the means to deal with her tenacity. His strategy, as far as I could tell, was to ignore her until she went away. That's never going to work to me. The only thing our father really cared about in his life was his work. The buildings he built and owned and rented out. He rarely sold anything, choosing instead to leverage what he had in order to buy more. When he had an appointment with the bank, the banker came to him, and my father made him wait. Mrs. Kennedy, my father's secretary, would offer the banker a cup of coffee and tell him it shouldn't be much longer, though sometimes it was. There was nothing the banker could do but sit there in the small anteroom of my father's office, holding his hat. The little attention my father had left at the end of the week he saved for me, and even that made it part of his job. He took me with him in the Buick on the first Saturday of every month to collect collect the book, to collect the books and the rent. And he gave me a pencil and ledger book so I could write down how much the tenants had paid in the column next to what they had owned. Very soon I knew who would never be home, who would be right there at the door with an envelope, and I knew who would have complaints. A toilet that ran, a toilet that was stopped, a light switch that was dead. Certain people came up with something every month and would not part with their money until the problem was resolved. My father, whose knee had been ruined in the war, limped slightly as he went to the trunk of his car and pulled out whatever was needed to make things right. When I was a boy, I thought of the trunk as a sort of magic chest. Pliers, clamps, hammers, screwdrivers, caulk, nails, everything was there. Now I know the things that people ask you for on a Saturday morning that tend to be easy fixes, and my father liked to do those jobs himself. He was a rich man, but he wanted to show people he still knew how things worked. Or maybe the show was all for me, because he didn't need to drive around picking up rent any more than he needed to drag his bad leg up a ladder to inspect a patch of loose shingles. He had a maintenance man for that. Maybe it was for my sake that he rolled up his shirt sleeves and pulled the top off a stove to inspect the heating element, while I stood there marveling at all the things he knew. He would tell me to pay attention, because one day the business was going to be mine. I would need to know how things were done. The only way to really understand what money means is to have been poor, he said to me when we were eating lunch in the car. That's the strike you have against you. A boy who grows up rich like you, never wanting for anything, never being hungry. He shook his head as if it had been a disappointing choice that I'd made. I don't know how a person overcomes a thing like that. You can watch these people all you want and see what it's like being them, but that's not the same as living it yourself. He put down his sandwich and took a drink of coffee from the thermos. Yes, sir, I said, because what else was there to say? The biggest lie in business is that it takes money to make money. Remember that. You've got to be smart, have a plan, pay attention to what's going on around you. None of that costs a dime. My father could write down exactly how much tenants had paid in the column next to what they owned. Very soon, I knew who would never be home, who would be right there at the door with an envelope. I knew who would have complained, toilet that ran. Did I read this? I'm sorry. A light switch that lit. Certain people came up with something every month and would not part with their money until the problem was resolved. My father, whose knee had been ruined in the war, limped slightly as he went to the trunk of his car and pulled out whatever was needed to make things right. When I was a boy, I thought of the trunk as a sort of chest. Pliers, clamps, hammers, screwdrivers, caulk, nails, everything was there. Now I know things people ask you for on Saturday morning to be the easy fixes, and my father's like doing this job himself. He was a rich man, but he wanted to show people he still knew how things worked. Or maybe the show was all for me, because he didn't need to drive around picking up rent anymore. He just rolled up his shirt sleeves, pulled off the top of a stove to inspect the heating element, while I stood there marveling at all the things that he knew. He would tell me to pay attention because it isn't to be mean. I would need to know how things work. The only way to really understand what money I messed up.
That's all right.
Okay. That's a strike that you have against you. A boy grows up just like you, never wanting for anything, never been hungry. He shook his head. I don't know how a person overcomes a thing like that. You can watch these people all you want and see what it's been like for them, but that's not the same as living it yourself. He put down his sandwich and took a drink of coffee from his thermos. The biggest lie in business is that it takes money to make money. Remember that. You've got to be smart, have a plan, pay attention to what's going on around you. He wasn't imparting much advice, and this seemed to worn him out. When he finished, he took his handkerchief from his pocket and ran across his forehead. When I'm in a charitable mood, I look back on this moment and I tell myself that this was the reason things played out the way they did. My father was trying to give the benefit of his experience. My father was always more comfortable with his tenants than he was with the people in his office or the people in his house. A tenant would start in on a story which sometimes was about the Phillies' inability to pitch against Brooklyn, and other times was about why there wasn't enough money in the envelope, and I could tell by the way my father was standing, he nodded hard on another, that he was paying attention. The people who were short on rent never complained about a window that was painted shut. They wanted the chance to tell him what had happened to them that month and to assure him that it wouldn't happen again. I never saw my father scold the tenants or make any threats. He only listened, and then he told them to try their best. But after 3 months of conversation, there would be a different family living in the apartment. When we came back again, I never knew what happened to the people with hard luck, but it happened on some day other than the first Saturday of the month. My father smoked more as the day went on. I sat beside him on the car's wide bench seat, looking over the numbers in the ledger, or staring out the window at the trees they flicked past. When my father smoked, I knew he was thinking, and that I was be quiet. The neighborhoods got to be worse as we headed into Philadelphia. He saved the very poorest of his tenants for the end of the day, as if it gave them extra hours to get together what they owed. I would rather have waited in the cars on those last stops, fiddling with the radio. I knew enough to skip the part where I would ask him to let me stay behind, and he would tell me no. The tenants in Mount Airy and Jenkintown were always nice to me, asking about school and basketball, offering me candy. I'd never been never to accept. Looking more like your daddy every day, they'd say, growing up just like him. But in the poorer neighborhoods, it's not that the tenants weren't nice, but they were nervous even when the money was in their hand, maybe thinking how it had been before or how it would be a month from now. They were differential not only to my father, but to me, and that deference that made me want to crawl out of my skin. Men older than my father called me Mr. Conroy when I was no more than, as if the resemblance they saw between the two of us was more than physical. Maybe they saw the situation the way they'd be paying rent to me, and so had no business calling me Danny. As we climbed the steps of buildings, I peeled off chips of paint and stepped over the broken slats. Half-open doors flapped on their hinges, and there were never any in. The heat in the hallways either ran to tropical or didn't run at all. It made me think what luxury it was to rattle on about a faucet in need of a washer, while failing to remind me that this too was a building my father owned, that it was within his power to open the trunk of his car and make things better for the people that lived there. One by one, he knocked on the doors, and the doors opened, and we listened to what the people inside had to say. Husbands out of work, husbands gone, wives gone, children sick. One time a man was going on about having the rest because his son had been so sick, and he had to himself. The boy and the man were alone in the dark apartment. Everyone else had gone, I guess. My father heard enough. He went into the living room, picked up the feverish child out. I had no idea what did it look like in those days, but the boy's arms swung back from his side, and his head dropped back in my father's arms. It put the fear of God in me. If it hadn't been for the deep congestion of his breathing, I would have thought we'd come too late. The air in this heavy with the mental suffering smell. Maybe the boy was 5 or 6. He was very small. My father carried him down the stairs, put him in the Buick, while the boy's father came behind us, saying there was no need to worry. It was fine. It'll be nothing. The boy's going to be fine. But he climbed into the back seat of our car all the same and rode beside his son to the hospital. I'd never seen neighborhoods that were so different. It's not that the tenants weren't nice, but they were nervous even when the money was in hand, maybe thinking how it had been a month before or how it would be a month from now. We listened to whatever the people had to say inside. When we got to the hospital, Father made arrangements with the woman at the desk, and then we left them there. Driving back to our own house in the dark without saying a single word about what had happened. Why would he have done that, Maeve had asked me the night after dinner when we were in her bedroom. Our father never took Maeve to collect the rent, even though she was 7 years older than me and had won the math prize in school every year and would have been so much better with the ledger. First day of every month after we used the ball, and Father had to the library, his paper. Maeve would pull me into her bedroom and close the door. She went counting of the entire day, blow by blow, what had happened in the department, what the tenants had said, what our father had said. That kid was really sick after all. Wait a minute. I'm just lost here. Skip. Well, when we got to the hospital, my father had told me to go to the men's room and wash my hands, to get the water hot, and use soap even though I hadn't touched the boy. Maeve mulled this over. What? I asked. Well, think about it. He hates sick people. He has ever so much the room to your. Has he ever so much crossed the room door to your room when you were sick? She stretched out on the bed beside me, fluffing the pillow under my head. If you're going to put your feet on my bed, then at least take off your filthy shoes. I kicked off my shoes. Did he sit on the edge of my bed and put his hand on my forehead? Did he bring me a ginger ale? Ask me if I felt like I was going to throw up again? That's what Maeve did. That's what Sandy and Jocelyn did when Maeve was at school. He never comes into my room. But why would he have done all that if the boy's father was there? I almost never got an answer before Maeve did. But in this case, it was perfectly obvious. Before, the mother wasn't there. If there had been a woman in the apartment, he never would have put himself into the middle of things. Mothers were the measure of safety, which meant that I was safer than Maeve. After our mother left, Maeve took up the job on my behalf, but no one did the same for her. Of course, Sandy and Jocelyn mother us. We were their lunches were our scouting newspaper. They loved it, I know they did. But they went home at the day. There was no crawling into bed with Sandy or Jocelyn. We had a bad dream in the middle of the night. And it occurred to me to knock on my father's door. I went to Maeve. She taught me the proper way to hold a fork. She attended my basketball games. She knew all my friends and oversaw my homework. And she kissed me every morning before we went our separate ways to school, and again at night before I went to bed, regardless of whether or not I wanted to be kissed. She told me repeatedly, relentlessly, that I was kind, smart, fast, I could be as great as I made up my mind to be. She was so good at all that, despite the fact that no one had done it for her. For me, surprised that it even brought it up. Listen, kid, I was the lucky one. I got years with her, and you didn't. I can't even think about how much you must miss her. But how could I miss someone I'd never known? I was only 3 at the time, and if I knew what was happening, I had no memory of it. Sandy was the one who told me the whole story, though parts of it I knew, of course, from my sister. Maeve had been 10 when our mother first started to leave. One morning, Maeve got out of bed and opened Dave's tapes over the window seat. It had snowed during the night, and it had. Dutch house was freezing. There was a fireplace in Maeve's bedroom, and Sandy kept dry wood on the grate above the bed of crumpled newspaper, so that in the morning all Maeve had to do was strike a match, something she had been allowed to do since her 8th birthday. Mommy gave me a box of matches for my 8th birthday, she told me once. Her mother had given her mother had given her a box of matches when she turned 8, and they spent the morning learning how to strike them. She showed me how to light the fire, and then that night she let me light the candles on my cake. Maeve lit the fire and put on her robe and slippers and came next door to my room to check on me. I was 3, still asleep. I had no part in this history. Then she crossed the hall to our parents' room and found it empty and the bed already made. Maeve went back to her room to get ready for school. She had brushed her teeth, washed her face, and was halfway dressed when Fluffy came in to wake her up. "Every morning you beat me," Fluffy said. "You should wake me up earlier," Maeve said. Fluffy told her she didn't need to get up any earlier. The fact that our father already had left the house wasn't unusual. The fact that our mother wasn't in the house was unusual. Without President, Sandy, Jocelyn, and Fluffy all seemed to be themselves. If they weren't worried, there was no reason to worry. Our mother was the one who took Maeve to school, but on this morning, Fluffy drove, letting out the lunch that Jocelyn packed. At the end, Fluffy picked her up again. Maeve asked her mother, "Was your father?" Our mother went there at dinner, and when our father appeared, Maeve asked him where he'd gone. He wrapped her in his arms and kissed her neck. Such happened in those days. Told Maeve her mother had gone to Philadelphia to visit old friends. Without saying goodbye, she said goodbye to me, our father said. She got up very early. I was up early. Well, she was up even before you, and she told me to tell you she'd see you in a day or two. Everybody should. From what? Maeve asked. When what she meant, from me, from us, from the house. He took her hand and walked her in to dinner. This place is a big responsibility. How big of a responsibility could it have been when Jocelyn and Sandy and Fluffy did so much of the work, and the gardeners came to take care of the lawn, the leaves, shovel the snow, when Maeve would have done anything in the world to be helpful? Our mother wasn't there when Maeve woke up the next morning, and again, Fluffy drove her to school and picked her up. But when they came back to the house on that second day, our mother was sitting in the kitchen drinking tea with Sandy and Jocelyn. I was playing on the floor, taking the lids off all the pots. She looked so tired, Maeve told me. She looked like she hadn't been to sleep the whole time. Our mother put down her cup and pulled Maeve into her lap. "There's my darling," she said, and kissed her forehead and kissed the part on her hair. "There you are my true love." Maeve put her arms around our mother's neck and rested her head against our mother's chest and breathed her in while our mother stroked her hair. "Who gets a girl like this?" she asked Sandy and Jocelyn. "Who gets a beautiful girl who's kind and smart? What did I ever do to deserve a girl like this?" Some version of this story happened 3 more times. Over the course of the next 2 months, our mother was gone for 2 nights, then 4 nights, and then a week. Maeve started getting up in the middle of the night to check our parents' room to make sure she was still there. Sometimes our mother was awake, and she would see Maeve at the door, lift the covers, and Maeve would float across the room to the bed without making a sound and slip into the warm curve of her body. She would fall asleep without thinking, her mother's arms around her, her mother's heartbeat and breath behind her. No other moment in life matched this. "Could you say goodbye to me before you leave?" Maeve would ask her, and our mother would just shake her head. "I never do that. Never in a million years could I say goodbye to you." Was our mother sick? Was she getting worse? Maeve nodded. She was turning into a ghost. 1 week she was thin, then she was paler. Everything deteriorated so fast. We were all folding up. Mother would come home and cry for days. I would go and sit with her in her bed after school. Sometimes you'd be in the bed with her playing. Whenever Dad was home, he always looked like he was trying to catch her, like he might, as well as having been walking her around with his hands out. Sandy and Justin and Fluffy, they were all nervous as cats by then, but no one talked about it. When she was gone, it was unbearable. And when she was home, it was unbearable in a different way, because we knew she was going to leave us again. When she did leave again, Maeve asked our father when she was back. For a very long time. He didn't know what part of the truth he was supposed to tell a 10-year-old, and what he decided on was the whole thing. He told Maeve there wasn't coming back. She had gone to India, and she didn't come back. Maeve could never make up her mind what part of this story was the worst, that her mother was gone, or that India was on the other side of the planet. No one goes to India. Maeve, he said, maybe she hasn't left yet. She didn't believe him, not for a minute. But if the story had been started, it needed to be stopped. Our father shook his head, but he didn't reach for her. Somehow, that might have been the strangest part of all. This was the story of our mother leaving, and this was the point at which the story stopped. There should have been questions, explanations. If she was in India, father should have find her and bring her back. But none of this happened because Maeve stopped up in the morning. She wouldn't go to school. Sandy would bring her a tray of cream of wheat and sit on the edge of her bed, trying to talk her into taking a couple of bites. But she said Maeve was rarely persuaded. Everyone saw it, and as the understandable sickness of a girl longing for her mother, they were all suffering from some related version, and so they let the child sink down into it, never really thinking about the fact that she would still drink her orange juice, and drink her glass of water. I'm having trouble with this. And drink her pot of chamomile tea. She'd take her cup of bath and pour over again until she finally stuck her head in the sink and drank from the running tap. Fluffy would bring me into Maeve's room, put me into her bed, and Maeve would read me a story before falling back to sleep. Then one afternoon, less than a week after our mother left for good, Maeve didn't wake up. Fluffy shook her, and then swooped Maeve up in her arms and ran down the stairs and out to the car. Where was everyone then? Where had our father and Sandy and Jocelyn gone? Where was I? Sandy said she couldn't remember. Such a terrible time, she said, shaking her head. What she knew was that Fluffy drove Maeve to the hospital and carried her into the lobby where some nurses took the sleeping child from her arms. She stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. The doctor said the diabetes could have brought on by trauma, or it could have been a virus. The body had all sorts of means to deal with what we understood. In the hospital, Maeve swam in and out of consciousness while they worked to stabilize her blood sugar. Everything that happened to her was a part of a dream. She told herself her mother wasn't allowed to visit, a punishment meted out for something she had done and she couldn't quite remember. The Sisters of Mercy, all friends of our mother, came to see her. Two girls from Sacred Heart presented her with a card signed by the entire class. They weren't allowed to. Her father would, in the evenings, though he said very little, he would hold Maeve's foot through the white cotton blanket and needed to get her out. No one was up for this. Jocelyn and Sandy and Fluffy took turns staying with her in the room. One of us for you, one for your brother, and one for your father, Sandy would say. Everyone's covered. Sandy said that when she needed to cry, she would wait until Maeve was asleep, and then she would go out into the hall. After Maeve came home from the hospital, things got worse.
Went off the air.
That's,
Do you want to mark what page you're on there?
yep.
And this there's a recording of this, so I can go back and find kind of like the right
Let's see.
sentence that you're on.
I was almost to the end.
How much longer do you think? A couple pages?
Another half a page.
Oh boy. So probably the next reader will have to pick up where you left off,
Okay.
and then they can go from there.
Who's the next reader? I could show her.
I'm not quite sure.
Oh, I could find out, I guess. So I'll show you how much is left.